Good evening, Adab, Namaskar, Sat Sri Akal. Today marks the birth anniversary of Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, and we are all gathered here to pay tribute to one of India's cultural icons, who was a journalist, filmmaker, storyteller, and in being all of these, he was first and foremost a humanist and a truth teller. अब्बास साहब की फिल्में, उनकी कहानियां, उनके न्यूज़पेपर कॉलम्स आम आदमी की रोजमर्रा जिंदगी से जुड़े हुए थे. And his journalistic writings never shied away from asking tough, pointed, and pertinent questions of leaders and figures of authority. His famous column, The Last Page, was started in 1937 and later moved from the Bombay Chronicle to Blitz, where it ran till his death in 1987. Blitz के masthead पे लिखा होता था, free, frank, and fearless. अब्बास साहब followed this motto throughout his life. और मुझे लगता है कि आज के माहौल में हमें इन शब्दों की अहमियत पर गौर करने की जरूरत है. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Khwaja Ahmad Abbas Memorial Trust, its trustees, and the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, I welcome you all to the Khwaja Ahmad Abbas Memorial Lecture. It is my privilege to introduce you to our special guest, Mohini Giri, and the chair for today's program, Kamla Bhasin. Mohini Giri is a social activist and leader in the women's movement, specializing in human rights and gender justice. She is well known for her tremendous grassroots and advocacy work for marginalized women. She is the former chairperson of the National Commission for Women and is currently the chairperson of the Guild for Service, an organization which provides advocacy for women's and children's rights for education, employment, and financial security. She also ran a home for widows at Vrindavan, which provides a safe haven, job training, and dignity to many displaced widows. Mohini Ji also served as founder president of the War Widow Association and as founder trustee of the Women's Initiative for Peace in South Asia since the year 2000. Welcome, Mohini Ji. And the chair for today's program is Kamla Bhasin, who is a noted feminist, peace activist, and a social scientist. Her work focuses on gender, education, human development, and the media. She's an advisor for Jagori, Women's Resource and Training Center, and the South Asia coordinator for 1 Billion Rising. She has worked with underprivileged women from tribal and working communities, often using posters, plays, and other non-literary methods to get through to communities with low literacy rates. She is perhaps best known for her work with Sangat, a feminist network, and for her poem, Kyunki Main Ladki Hoon, Mujhe Padhna Hai. Her passionate and fiery poem, Azadi, has become an anthem for women's movements all over South Asia. From patriarchy, Azadi. From all hierarchy, Azadi. From endless violence, Azadi. From helpless silence, Azadi. Welcome, Kamla Ji. I request you to please say a few words.
Barabari Zindabad, Insaf Zindabad, Insaniyat Zindabad, Indian Constitution Zindabad. अब्बास साहब का जन्मदिन है आज. हम लोग जो ज्यादा अंग्रेजी नहीं जानते कहते हैं आज उनका हैप्पी बर्थडे है. अब्बास साहब की पैदाइश, उनका जन्म हम सबको मुबारक, हमको मुबारक. अगर वो पैदा ना हुए होते, अगर उन्होंने 73 साल में 75 किताबें न लिखी होती, अखबारों में हजारों कॉलम्स न लिखे होते, 40 यादगार फिल्में न बनाई होती उन मौजूओं पर जिन पर बहुत कम लोग बोला करते हैं, तो आप सोचिए कि इंडिया और पाकिस्तान के लोग कितने गरीब रह जाते. Friends, when people like Abbas Sahab leave their bodies, only their bodies die. They don't. Their ideas don't. See, Abbas Sahab is here with us today. I wish to express this sentiment in the words of another creative person from India, Pakistan, Sahir Ludhianvi. वो कहते हैं कि जिस्म की मौत कोई मौत नहीं होती है, जिस्म मिट जाने से इंसान नहीं मर जाते, धड़कने रुक जाने से अरमान नहीं मर जाते, सांस थम जाने से ऐलान नहीं मर जाते, होठ जम जाने से फरमान नहीं मर जाते, जिस्म की मौत कोई मौत नहीं होती है. Friends, Abbas Sahab, whom my friend Saida calls a man who saw tomorrow, is with us. He is in the farmers' movement today. He is fighting with us against what is happening in Lakshadweep. He is with us in every struggle for justice and equality, not just in India, in South Asia and globally. Abbas Sahab is hand in hand, heart in heart with Palagummi Sainath, who speaks and fights for the bottom 5% of Indians. Sainath does this because the other media cover only the top 5%. Sainath says journalism is for people, not for shareholders. Journalism, Sainath says, is for people who have been left behind, pushed behind, who are Dalit. तो दोस्तों, इन दो अवामी सितारों से यहीं पर है मिलन आज की शाम, मुस्कुराता है उम्मीदों का चमन आज की शाम. दोस्तों, जब तक अब्बास साहब और साईनाथ जैसे लोग हमारे साथ हैं, सपने जिंदा रहेंगे, उम्मीद जिंदा रहेगी, संघर्ष जिंदा रहेंगे, हम लड़ेंगे, जीतेंगे. What is so special about these two communicators? These two special beings जिन्हें कुछ कहना है, जो खामोश नहीं रहेंगे और जो हमारी खामोशी को भी ललकारते रहेंगे. What is special? I think both these beautiful beings have love, the four-letter word love, in their hearts. Unconditional, radical love. It is this love that does not allow them to be silent when they see hatred, injustice, inequality, when they see attacks on human rights, attacks on democracy, on our Ganga Jamuni culture, attacks on Mother Nature. That's why I'm not always calling them human beings. I'm calling them beings who can feel the love of all sentient beings. तो दोस्तों, मैं सलाम करती हूँ अजीज कुरैशी भाई को, जिन्होंने 2014 में अब्बास सेंटेनरी मनाने के लिए बहुत सारे लोगों को इकट्ठा किया. मैं सलाम करती हूँ सईदा हमीद और उनकी टीम को, सुप्रीत कालो, रूथ, रियाज, जो ख्वाजा अहमद अब्बास मेमोरियल ट्रस्ट को चला रहे हैं ताकि हम चलते रहें, सर्वे संतु सुखिना के ख्वाब देखते रहें, उनके लिए काम करते रहें. तो दोस्तों, मंजिल मुझे मिले ना मिले इसका गम नहीं, मंजिल की जुस्तजू में मेरा कारवां तो है. तो हमारे ये कारवां, ये संगत बड़े होते रहें, आगे बढ़ते रहें और हम लड़ेंगे और जीतेंगे. थैंक यू.
Thank you, Kamla ji. Thank you very much. I would now request the chairperson and founder of the Khwaja Ahmad Abbas Memorial Trust, Dr. Saida Hamid, to please say a few words.
Dear friends on this platform, it is an honor to welcome P. Sainath. मैं ये नहीं कहती कि मैं उनका तारुफ कराऊंगी, क्योंकि साइनाथ न सिर्फ हिंदुस्तान में बल्कि दुनिया भर में तारुफ के मोहताज नहीं है। 2014 में, जैसे अभी कमला ने कहा, हमने अब्बास साहब की सेंटेनरी में एक इनॉग्रेशन सेमिनार में उनको बुलाया था, जो 3 मूर्ति में हुई थी और बहुत ही अच्छी पहल हुई। अजीज कुरैशी साहब की छत्र छाया में हम ये काम कर सके। उसमें से चंद बातें याद करती हूँ जो साइनाथ ने कही हैं। And what he said at the time resonates with the subject that he has selected today. The state we are in, how COVID-19 has given us a brilliant, if unsparing autopsy of our society. Hard-hitting subject, but that is Sainath. Friends, let me begin with the rishta between Abbas and Sainath. Abbas's last will, published in Blitz the day after he died, he wrote in that his kafan should consist of his columns of last page and Azad Kalam in English, Urdu, and Hindi. He wrote, entrust this column to Sainath, who will carry the Khwaja Ahmad Abbas tradition. Abbas Sahab wrote separately to Sainath. He said, give me a promise. When I'm no more, you must continue to write the last page. Friends, what Sainath said at that seminar, in fact, is the connect between Abbas of the 60s, 70s, and 80s and the India, जिस हिंदुस्तान में हम आज सांस ले रहे हैं, हम रह रहे हैं 2020, 2021. Sainath said, Abbas wrote consistently about hunger, poverty, human suffering, exploitation, deluge, nation, and sickness. So I promised him I would carry on the column, but he should stop talking of death. Abbas asked Karanjia to maintain the purity and ideology of this column by giving it to Sainath. And finally, Sainath said something else, which I want to quote. He said, when we talk of last page, one thing comes to mind. It was never fake optimism or cynical pessimism. For fake optimism and cynical pessimism both lead you to do nothing. However, between them, there is hope, and that is where Abbas resides. Abbas was a dreamer to the last, but dreams that were the stuff of greatness, unquote. With these few words, it's my honor to invite Sainath to deliver the Khwaja Ahmad Abbas Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saida. I'm not just delighted, but honored to be here. I miss Abbas. I really do. And At the end of this talk from me, you will find what I have to say about the existence of a great subject material for an Abbas novel, Were He Alive? About the talk itself, the state we're in. It is a huge subject, and at the outset, I give you the statutory warning. Reality is bad for your health. Mental health, anyway. I will be looking not just at the state with an S capital, but also at our state of mind and the material and moral universe of our elite. I will try and take you through what I believe COVID-19 tells us about ourselves. Though through a few of the routes by which a state actively disables large sections of its own citizens, mostly the poorest. In a nation obsessed with numbers, every morning we get up and see about the number of vaccines, the number of deaths, the number of live cases, and everybody's grumbling because we know what the numbers really are. Numbers that we create, are very creative with, and with which we lie to ourselves about ourselves most of the time. I will delve into that national obsession and look at some sectors through it. Also, we need to look at why our devastating present problems, however bizarre, are a logically insane extension of a process and ideas that we embraced 30 years ago. So who runs the Indian state? India is ruled by an alliance of socio-religious fundamentalists and economic market fundamentalists, and saddled with a significant number of elites belonging to both camps. That peculiar character allows an easy flow between camps, corporations, factions, and political parties that is not so much a revolving door, but a roaring dance in the swamp. You can look at the pandemic two ways, okay? You can look at the pandemic as a great disruption. At many levels, it is. A great disruption, a sadistic spanner in India's incredible wheels of progress. Or you can look at it as a great exposure of an ossified elite intellect, one that illuminates our incredible inequalities, which are really the root of our problems, those structural inequalities so central to the distress around us. COVID-19. What's COVID-19 done? COVID-19 has given us a brilliant, thorough autopsy of who we are as a state and as a society. A terrific laying bare of the corpse of neoliberalism, indeed, of Indian capitalism itself. That corpse is on the table in glaring light, every vein, artery, organ, and bone staring us in the face. You know what? It was there earlier too. But this time, it doesn't let us turn our faces away. There's also a mirror in there somewhere. The Indian elite are today the most narcissistic elite in the world. And the past 30 years have seen the gross inequality we have constructed, building its own mindset, swamping the idealism of the earlier decades and the freedom struggle. A narcissistic elite, very appropriately, very well represented by a supreme leader who makes the word narcissism sound weak and inadequate. A supreme leader who speaks of himself always in the third person. You know, two groups of adults speak of themselves in the third person. One is those with the Caesar megalomania complex, you know, then falls Caesar, or the Pharaoh has spoken, so let it be written, so let it be done. That's one group. The other group are stand-up comedians. Now, Mr. Modi is not a comedian. It's very hard to imagine anyone less funny or more humorless. we just have to look at the obsession of this prime minister with the central vista. I won't even go there now. And how important it is to him, regardless of a pandemic in which hundreds of thousands will die, of a complete disruption of society, of a need for resources, 20,000 crores of which have been allocated to the vista, but which will be twice that amount before the day is done. Or even a person who's quite happy to have the world's largest cricket stadium renamed after himself, and the two, team ends, the pavilion ends of the stadium, appropriately named after his good old friends, Mukesh Ambani and Gautam Adani. But my talk here today, I'm saying it isn't just about him. Narendra Modi did not make the Indian elite. The Indian elite made Narendra Modi. Now he shapes it further powerfully in his own image, leaving a great impact on it. I'm arguing that the state we're in also owes itself to a huge intellectual capitulation, a surrender of the intellect, an embrace over 30 years of doctrines that were and are essentially, profoundly anti-poor, anti-human, the embrace of the market and neoliberalism, of the gospel of Saint Growth and Saint Greed and Saint Choice, of market fundamentalism as a national faith. Never in our history as a nation, as an independent nation, has inequality been so ruthlessly engineered, so cynically constructed. New inequalities that have entrenched and extended old existing ones. These have real consequences. When we signed up as subscribers to the delusions of the market and trickle-down theories, bought into the idea that markets somehow, as Thomas Frank put it, are a far more democratic form of government than democratically elected governments. That the market was somehow more just, more benevolent, more reasoned and thoughtful than human beings. When we bought into this, what followed? This followed. In 1991, India did not have a single dollar billionaire, not one. In 2020, we had 140. We added 38 new dollar billionaires in the first 12 months of the pandemic, probably the highest number we added in a year. And the total wealth of our billionaires doubled in the first 12 months of the pandemic. Remember this, that their wealth doubled at a time when India's GDP contracted by 7.7%. Their wealth doubled or went up by 90.4% to $596 billion. 140 individuals. You know what that means, by the way? In rupees, that's 44.5 trillion rupees. If you can accommodate 12 zeros in your head, a trillion has 12 zeros. It means 140 individuals in a population of 1.3 billion had a cumulative worth equivalent to more than 1/5 of your GDP. Their wealth is equivalent to 22.7% of your gross domestic product of $2.62 trillion, giving that whole other meaning to the word gross. The combined wealth of these 140 plutocrats went up 90 plus percent in a year when GDP contracted by 7.7%. Went up in the 12 months when tens of millions of Indians lost their jobs and millions were desperately trying to get back to their homes in the villages. Who the top dogs in the list of 140 are is neither an abstraction nor accidental. Mukesh Bhai's wealth went up by a modest 129% in 12 months to hit $84.5 billion. Adani's wealth soared by a healthy 467%. Perhaps it was in recognition of this feat that the two ends of the Narendra Modi Stadium in Ahmedabad, the world's greatest cricket stadium, were named after these two worthies who made it there with the sweat of their brows and a little bit of help from their friends. Note that Ambani's wealth now is almost equal to the gross domestic product, the GSDP of Punjab. $85.85 billion is Punjab's GSDP, a state whose farmers stand poised to lose a lot of their wealth to him and Adani. And surprise, surprise, 24 of our 140 billionaires are in the health sector. And as Forbes magazine, from where I'm giving you these numbers, the oracle of global capitalism, Forbes, as Forbes points out, the top 10 of our healthcare billionaires added 24.9 billion to their wealth in the pandemic year, which means that those of our billionaires in health, our top 10, added every day of the pandemic, on average, they added 5 billion rupees every single day on average to their cumulative wealth, boosting their worth by 75% in a year to bring it to 4.3 trillion rupees. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum, a very large end of the spectrum. In that decade in which our billionaires scaled their zenith, the Socio-Economic and Caste Census of India told us that in 2012, 75% of all rural households, there are 179 million rural households in India. And the Socio-Economic Caste Census tells us that in 75% of India's 179 million rural households, the main breadwinner was taking home less than 5,000 rupees a month in fully 3/4 of rural households. By the way, that figure goes up from 75% to 90% if you raise the bar to 10,000 rupees a month. In the first year of the pandemic, and I want you to follow this figure closely and see if you can ever come to terms with it in your mind. In the first year of the pandemic, Mukesh Ambani added 3.57 trillion rupees to his already considerable wealth. That is to say, not how much he added every month or every day or even hour. He added 1.13 lakh rupees every single second. Every single second of that year, on average, he added 1.13 lakh rupees to his already considerable wealth. Every second. Now, the promise of global capital, the promise of capitalism, especially of neoliberalism, and the promise of capitalism as in general, is that with hard work, you and I can do it too. You know, with hard work, you and I can do it too. This overlooks the fact that if hard work made you a billionaire, every woman in rural India would be a billionaire. Every woman in Asia, rural woman in Asia, Africa, and Latin America would be a billionaire. Nobody works harder than them. Let's see if it's true that one of us can also do it. A common Indian can also do it. Let's examine that promise. Let's say NREGS did not give 100 days per household, but allowed a laborer, willing and strong, to work full 365 days. The average wage now is 225 nationally. If he worked 365 days, or she worked, more likely, she worked 365 days a year without break, how long would it take for them to earn what Ambani did last year? It would take 42 million years to equal what 42 million, I'm not joking, 42 million years to make what Ambani made in a single year. Now, I cannot believe that any society can indefinitely sustain these level of gaps and inequalities. When tens of millions of children savaged by the pandemic with their schools closing down, loss of midday meal, gigantic profits were made in the rise of online education. I just asked the audience, how many girls below 18 do you know? Certainly. How many rural girls do you know below the age of 18 who own smartphones, who are otherwise have to wait for father or big brother to come back from the brick kiln on Saturday, Sunday, and download their PDFs if they can afford that? But Baiju Ravindran, you know Baiju the education, he's on the Forbes list. He added 39% to his own wealth and is now worth 187 billion rupees. Of course, our tech billionaires can't be left behind in such a promising situation. The top 10 of our tech billionaires added every single day 4.6 billion rupees to their cumulative wealth. But that juxtaposition of numbers doesn't interest the media or the elite. Now, in the last few weeks, people have rightly begun to protest, a few of them vociferously, over the fraudulent COVID-19 and infection cases numbers. Good. I'm very glad they're protesting. Yes, the figures relating to the deaths, the oxygen shortages, the available beds and facilities, especially the numbers of COVID-19 deaths, should outrage any decent human being. Look at Uttar Pradesh, where we in the People's Archive of Rural India reported over 1,621 school teachers died in the space of a month after being forced to do compulsory duty in Uttar Pradesh's Panchayat polls. And how did the government respond? The Department of Basic Education issued a press statement using existing Election Commission guidelines to say that so far as they were concerned, they needed to compensate only 3 deaths. They could say this quite openly in a press statement and get away with it for that time. What they are doing is using a bogus definition of death on duty, and this nation is the master of definitions. They were using a bogus definition of death on duty, which they interpreted as someone who dropped dead at the polling or counting venue or expired on the way home. Now, the way COVID-19 functions, people get infected at the training camps or the voting booths or on counting day and die some days later. But under the state's interpretation, they are not counted as those who died on duty. So they're not entitled to compensation. Now, this could happen because of a system designed and desired over decades to trivialize the misery of the many. Also, not just the numbers and definition system, but the death certification system have always worked to the advantage of cover-ups, of massaging of data of people in power. Even when the rules, let's say tomorrow, Yogi Adityanath changes the rules. Even then, many of these 1,621 people's families will get no compensation because the death certificates issued to their families do not say they died of COVID-19. So even if we change the interpretation of the guidelines, many are not going to get compensated. So the outrage is correct and well-deserved. However, there's a danger in not linking our outrage to the larger disease, a dishonesty in failing to acknowledge that our numbers fraud is not an aberration, just a novel extension of the normal. It is not a failure of the system. It is the system. The dishonesty is in the design and in our desires. Since it now affects the beautiful people, well, then we're compelled to take note of it, right? And it hurts us. Let's look at the numbers around, let's look at our attitude towards the migrants. We were all shocked last year when the first reverse migrations, I'll butt in here, I'll interject this line here. that for more than 20, 25 years, I spent 40 to 60 days a year with migrants traveling various routes in different parts of the country. We were all shocked when the first reverse migrations took place. Many of us were shocked to know that there were so many of them in the first place. We were jolted to the realization by our loss of the services, labor, and comforts that they brought to us in our cities. It's simply not, it's a bit hypocritical, okay? Because a decade ago, Census 2011 told us, warned us, that the greatest migrations in our history as an independent nation had occurred between 2001 and 11. The urban-rural growth differential was at its highest in 40 years. It was clear that a lot of this migration was driven by economic distress. But the distress was theirs, not ours. Why did they leave the village? We kept asking ourselves, the newspapers, the anchors said, why are they going back? Why are they leaving their jobs in the cities and going back? The real question was, why did they leave their villages in the first place? And the answer is two words: agrarian crisis, which destroyed millions of livelihoods in the countryside and provided us with a perpetual pool of cheap labor. I cannot recall a single lead editorial last year in a major newspaper or a senior anchor bashing the government as it deserved to be bashed for asserting in the Supreme Court on March 31, 2020, that, quote, as of 11 a.m. this morning, nobody is on the roads. That was Solicitor General Tushar Mehta telling the top court that there were no migrants on the streets, even as the world's greatest movement of human beings was well underway. Barely 2 months later, the Indian Railways said they had transported 9.1 million migrant laborers back to their home regions in 26 days. For those millions walking on the highways, not blessed enough to make it to the trains, how did we treat those millions on the walking on the highways? The union government passed a fatwa prohibiting any movement at all between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., which meant that these millions had to walk in April and May temperatures at the height of the sun and the heat. Yeah, so that's how we treated them. By the way, when I look at the data and the criticism of the data, and I'm perplexed. Look at farmers' suicides. For years and years now, the data on the farmers has been patently false. We have been, as a nation, lying to ourselves. Okay? Sure, we are all horrified when we read the official figure. 330,000 farmers, 330,000 farmers have taken their own lives in the last 2 decades. The real numbers, if you could get them, would horrify you. I would say that for the 18 years, the National Crime Records Bureau honestly collated the numbers of farmers' suicides. They honestly collated, but the numbers were nonsense because of the social, political, and policy prejudices that went into the data collection. For instance, thousands and thousands of women farmers who took their own lives are not counted in the farm suicides list, simply because in this country, we do not accept and respect women as farmers, or because women's names very rarely appear on the patta or title deed. Those were sins of omission. But since 2014, the sins of commission have rapidly overtaken the sins of omission. The present regime of Mr. Narendra Modi has muddied the methodology so basely, so badly, and even withheld the data for 3 years at one time, that the data now stand totally corrupted. But please do not imagine that this begins with this regime. This regime specializes in taking every absurdity to its extreme. That they do, and they do it very efficiently. But since 2011, government after government has simply declared zero farmers' suicides in their states. In the data of 2013, a year before the election, you will find that the 12 states, 12 Indian states, and 6 union territories declared zero farmers' suicides. And even then you end up with 330,000. Even these fake numbers were so embarrassing that the Modi government shut down the National Crime Records Bureau. It wound it up and merged it into a nondescript department called the Bureau of Police Research and Development. Okay, but it was so damaging to the nation's data that after 10 months, a government that never steps back actually reversed its decision and revived the NCRB, but a gutted, eviscerated version of the NCRB. Simply put, if you don't like the numbers, switch definitions, get new ones. The system is allowed to design, even encourages that. And there are apologists, paid and voluntary, ready and willing to certify the charade as authentic. Every day you see them on the edit pages of your newspapers and on your television screens. I'll emphasize again and again, it isn't an aberration. It's who we are as a state and as a society, as a system founded on and rooted in deep structural inequalities. Have we forgotten the every few year debate that we have over poverty figures? Every Indian who knows anything about them has learned to be skeptical of them. We all know how dicey they are. When will we accept that they were and are dicey by design and by desire? That we tell ourselves lies, that because that way we get to live with ourselves and even appear compassionate from time to time. If you look at the year 1995, it was one of the most extraordinary years where we produced two diametrically different poverty figures within weeks of each other in the same year. One figure was both official. One was 39.9% of population BPL. The other was 19%. The higher figure served us when we went to the World Summit on Social Development in Copenhagen with our begging bowl for aid. The lower 19% served very well as propaganda in the then forthcoming 96 March elections. Come back to our health issues of today, how justifiably outraged we all are by the trash we are asked to accept as COVID-19 death figures. Okay? I'm sorry, but there was no similar outrage. There was no similar outrage when the WHO Global Tuberculosis Report of 2019 said nearly 450,000 Indians had died of TB in that single year. More than the total number of COVID deaths that we are willing to admit, okay, officially, since February 2020. The outrage was not over 450,000 TB deaths. The outrage was directed at the WHO. The Indian government asserted that the figure was merely 79,000. And there was no questioning of the government by the media or by the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, the public intellectuals. Nothing happened. In 1994, you'll remember, some of you will remember the Surat plague, which claimed 54 lives, but got 1,000 times the publicity that TB and diarrhea, which took about 500,000, got. But with the plague then, as with the pandemic now, our conscience is jolted better when beautiful people also suffer. Plague germs, you see, plague germs and viruses are notorious for their non-observance of class distinctions. On the other hand, tuberculosis remains, as the WHO points out, a disease of poverty and economic distress. Look at the people who are struggling and dying and unable to get any access to health resources. Who are they? In the countryside, in the Indian countryside, and for the last 20 years, out-of-pocket health expenditures by ordinary poor people, personal health expenditures by rural Indians has remained for 20 years, probably the fastest growing component of rural family debt. In June 2018, the Public Health Foundation of India concluded that 55 million people had fallen below the poverty line in a single year because of having to fund their own health issues. It's happening all over again on a gigantic scale. The PHFI also said that 38 million of those 55 million had fallen below the poverty line due to spending on medicines alone. Sounds familiar? Yet, we are the nation charging people for vaccines. How many nations in the world are charging people for vaccines? How many, you have 20,000 crores for the Central Vista, but you don't have the money to give out vaccines free as you should to every single human being in this country. We are the nation, China is vaccinating about 8 times the number of people we do every day. They will finish vaccinating their population in 80 days if they retain that. We are going to take a minimum of 2 years at the present rate. And yet, we are happy to give the private sector, 2 companies, so much control over the entire vaccine thing. And the vaccine and the private sector generally having been given 25% of the vaccines, we learn from Rema Nagarajan's brilliant expose of it. Of the 25% handed over to the private sector vaccines, 6 corporate chain hospitals have grabbed 50% of it. Where we live, in this country, we became that great vaccine power, not because of private corporations, but because of the public sector. The pulse polio, the immunization programs that came right up to the 2000s, 80% of that came from the public sector. And we are simply not willing. We just want 2 companies, Bharat Bio and Serum Institute, to handle it all. When there are 11 public sector companies where you can immediately expand vaccine production, they are ready, they are fit, they have the infrastructure, they have the capacity, but you can't do that. Public is bad, private is good. That was the ideology we embraced 30 years ago. Look at the fact that the capitalist nations of Ireland and Spain nationalized all health services in those countries in the first week of the pandemic in their countries. Here we still cling to those false shibboleths. Public bad, private good and efficient. We are killing the public sector, swelling the profits of the privateers, and not willing to play the role that a government we don't need to discuss the fact or debate the issue that we live under the nastiest government in independent India's history. This is without question the nastiest and the most mean-minded regime that we have ever been saddled with. But again, as I say, it isn't just about them. Look at how we approach data and numbers on hunger deaths, malnutrition deaths, starvation deaths. We don't even discuss any of those anymore, right? Because hunger deaths have ceased to happen in India. As late as 2016, the Bombay High Court came down on the government of the state. Late September 2016, the Bombay High Court slammed the government of Maharashtra for doing nothing when 18,000 children, mainly Adivasi children, died in a single year in just 11 districts of the state of acute malnutrition. The court called it criminal negligence. Actually, it wasn't. It was the bizarrely logical outcome of consciously made criminal economic policies. it was fashionable, as Saida and Kamla and others know better than I do, it was fashionable even in the 1980s to dismiss hunger or starvation deaths on the grounds that the post-mortems had revealed that there were some food contents in the deceased person's stomach. Remember that? That's how we used to dismiss it. Maharashtra, where I'm seated, was the pioneer, okay? As early as 1963, the legislature of Maharashtra passed an act banning the use of the word famine in any government legislation, in any law, in any document. You banned the word. So it was called the Maharashtra Deletion of the Term Famine Act. At the end of this intervention in 10, 15 minutes, I will show you the slides if you want, because I know nobody will believe that we passed a law banning the use of the word famine. So no matter if we actually have a famine in Maharashtra, we can't have one legally, okay? You can't have a legal famine. We have also in 2018-17, the Modi government has made it virtually impossible for many water scarce districts for us to have a declaration of drought over there. They simply revised the drought manual completely. I mean, what the Modi government has done to the drought manual is well, it's only a literary person writing a grand novel who can come out of that, maybe a Kafka. The thing is, hunger is still such a big issue, okay? It is still 3 out of 4 rural Indians cannot afford a nutritious diet, according to a paper published in 2020. But here's the catch. We all know that they can't afford it. But here's the catch. Even if they spent 100% of their income, every single paisa of their income, if they spent on food, 63% of the Indian rural population, 520 million people, would not be able to afford a basically nutritious diet, even if they spent 100% of their income on food. Now, if they spend even a third of that income on non-food expenses, rent, commuting, education, health, then 76% of all rural Indians cannot afford a basic nutritious diet. And remember last year, a pandemic year in which food grain buffer stocks for the sheer callousness, if that was an event in the Olympics, we'd take all the medals, the Modi government. A pandemic year during which food grain buffer stocks at one point reached 104 million tons in August last year. But all that people were granted was 5 kilograms of wheat or rice and 1 kilogram of pulses free for 6 months. That too, only those covered by the National Food Security Act, which excludes a significant proportion of the needy. This in a year when hundreds of millions of Indians were hungrier than ever before in living memory. As for the tomfoolery we do with GDP numbers, how they're constructed, critiqued, consumed, I won't even go there. Even the Indian census, the finest document we have on data, has innumerable problems built into it, mainly related to ancient tribes, etc. The Indian state has the capacity, the machinery, the resources, the ability to build far better data systems, repair and upgrade the existing ones. The problem is not failure, it's policy and design. We built the system we needed. Those are the numbers rulers need. The numbers many of us rage at when they affect us directly, but just click our tongues at in token criticism when they don't. Changing that requires the elite's recognition of our own complicity in building the India and the state we are now in. In the last few years, you see, every one of us is rightly, correctly, justifiably fearful and concerned about the criminalization of dissent that the Modi government has unleashed. But again, Mr. Modi has taken to the extreme, as he always does, processes that also existed earlier. Criminalization of dissent is at its peak, but it's been on for decades in the countryside, where we slam hundreds of false cases on communities defending their land, which we are trying to take away and give to corporates, and for Adivasis trying to defend their forests. Look, Abbas Sahu, the anti-POSCO agitator who won the battle, has some 57, 60 cases, false cases filed on his head. SP Uday Kumar, who led the Kudankulam movement, at one stage had 91 cases on his head. And now they have the BJP has brought its own peculiar communal flavor to the utilization of those laws and stretched them beyond recognition. Just look at poor Siddiqui Kapan, whose crime, apart from being a known journalist, which is a crime, is that he is also a Muslim. That is essentially the point. Okay, others went to Hathras who have not been detained and not permitted to meet their lawyer for 2 months. Through the past 7 years of the Modi regime, we've had laws, or more often, ordinances promulgated arbitrarily by this government. Labor laws that completely throw workers at the mercy of powerful corporations. Agricultural laws that destroy the livelihoods of millions of farmers. State after state has passed laws like the love jihad laws, anti-love jihad laws, mercilessly unleashed against that eternal target of the BJP, Muslims and other minorities after them. Media laws have been brought in a dime a dozen to choke the one remaining small sector of independent digital media. And then there is the kind of Kappan cases, more than 100 of them in different spheres. It's June 7th today. In less than 20 days, we will go through our annual ritual of observing the emergency, the end of the emergency. One day in a year, we ritualize our rejection of the emergency. The remaining 364 days, we institutionalize our embrace of an emergency. One law or the other, one law or the other. It's been happening from the 1980s and dramatically from the 1990s. And what we do with our laws and what we do in power. Look at Kashmir. The outrageous punishment of a population in feudal terms, collective punishment. So somebody shot someone somewhere. So you have an internet shutdown for 6 months. The dissolution and scrapping of an entire state. I mean, how is it that this is not at the forefront of media discussion? What it means to dismantle the constitution, to dismantle the nation itself. Several of the regressive laws of the Modi government were passed not in the last 7 years, but at the height of the pandemic. There was no earthly reason why the 3 farm laws had to be passed in September 2020, introduced in June 2020, passed in September 2020. There was the most cynical of motives in that. The idea was that these damn peasants, pulverized by the pandemic, cowering before COVID-19, would not dare organize and strike back. That was a fatal miscalculation. Tens of thousands of them gathered at Delhi's gates. What were they met with? They were met with trenches dug on the highways, 10-foot by 10-foot trenches dug by the security forces, by barbed wire fences, water cannons, tear gas. The camps they dug into were subjected and are subjected to internet shutdowns, electricity and water shutoffs. They lived in the open of one of Delhi's coldest winters and now face a horrible summer, but they have held out. Okay? Many months and 300 plus lives later, they're still there. I need to tell this audience this. The laws aren't just about farmers. They're about you. They're about all of us. They strike at and undermine one of the most important of our fundamental rights. And if we have the time, Saida, I'll show you the slides at the end. There are 4 clauses in 2 of these laws that undermine one of the most important of our fundamental rights, Article 32 of the Constitution, the right to legal remedy, the right to legal redress. You cannot challenge these laws as a farmer or even as any citizen. You cannot challenge them in a court of law. They create a system where the executive, a very low level of executive, okay, district collectors, naib tehsildars, they become the judiciary. They strike at the right to legal redress. They privilege corporations over communities. And now these clauses are being introduced in anti-cow slaughter laws as well. So we are bringing in protection for vigilante groups. There are clauses in the Karnataka anti-cow slaughter bill, law now, which actually say that any party exercising power under these laws will be deemed to be public servants. So the VHP and the Bajrang Dal can run riot, indulge in lynching, arson. I mean, they hardly require an invitation to do that, but they can be deemed public servants because they're acting to enforce a law in good faith, in public interest. There is no definition of what is good faith and public interest. As I'm running out of time, I can't say more about big media and corporate media, which I'm desperate to do because that is my area. But they are central to this project of the new India, yeah, of saffron capitalism. Except perhaps to say, I spoke of an alliance at the beginning of my talk. I spoke of the alliance between religious fundamentalists and market fundamentalists. This happy marriage cohabits a bed called corporate media. At a time when the public have needed journalism as never before in independent India, corporate media has sacked some 2,000 journalists and many times that number of non-journalist media workers. They're also terrible cowards. You know, I think that it's time we said this. These highly respected editors, prominent figures, they're simply bloody cowards. You can hear the knees knocking in those pitiful editorials where they manage to say something, make a little bleat of protest. They run editorials vigorously slamming the farmers at the Delhi border, accusing them of being a COVID spreader while maintaining a spineless silence over that ultimate super spreader, the Kumbh Mela. I did not see an editorial questioning the fact that the Kumbh Mela was advanced by a year. Why was it advanced by a year? Oh, there is an astrological justification. Every 83 years, 1855, 1938. But there are also historical precedents for the Kumbh Mela being postponed. In the 1940s, it happened. Yeah. The Kumbh Mela in Hardwar was due on 2022, but it was done in 2021. Why? Why were the UP Panchayat elections, which were postponed in the past, why were they not postponed this time? Because, my friends, by mid-March 2022, you have to constitute the new Assembly of Uttar Pradesh. And you needed to have those panchayat elections so that you had your sarpanchas, pradhans in control, and you needed to have a spectacular kumbh. And these morons actually believed that, they would say that the Ganga has cured the virus. We had such a If you had had this in 2022, it would have come after the elections because the main events of the Kumbh, Shani Snan, Shahi Snan, whatever, are all in April, whereas you have to finish in Uttar Pradesh elections by March. There are many things we can do, okay, to change the state we're in. Immediate things to address the giant farm crisis, immediate things to address the hunger. On the farm crisis, I've been shouting for years. The Nation for Farmers, a platform I am part of and represent, has been calling, let's have a special session of parliament on it. Repeal the 3 laws. You could have a special session of parliament for GST, which is killing all of us now, okay? And hold it at midnight, yeah? And the Rashtrapati ji came down in his carriage like Cinderella, yeah, to pass that. And unanimously, we passed that GST law. But we cannot have, in 16 years since the Swaminathan Commission report, we could not have one day's dedicated discussion on the agrarian crisis for India's 95 million farmers. But there are broader, we need a special session of parliament for that and related issues. We need a repealing of these 3 laws. We need every state assembly in the country to hold a special session on agrarian crisis, rural distress. But there is a larger, broader canvas, challenges to alter the state we're in. We could begin by defending a secular, democratic constitution being rapidly dismantled, but it means making fundamental choices. Yeah? Do we embrace the reforms, the so-called reforms, which destroyed hundreds of millions of livelihoods? Do we embrace that vision of India, the market vision, the neoliberal vision, or do we return to the vision of the freedom struggle embedded in your constitution and the vision that we have of what this country should be in the directive principles of state policy? There are choices we have to make in that, in recognizing our own complicity in what has happened. To conclude, let's face it, the elite have failed to face up to the situation. We are on our way to the consolidation of a corporate state, a saffron corporate state. The resistance that there is, and there is growing resistance, has come these past few years, not from us. It has come from farmers, workers, artists, singers, poets, writers, students, and youths. Remember the award Wapasi movements. How proud the writers and poets and singers and artists of this country made us. It's these who have shown and still show enormous courage and spirit. From ordinary everyday people, those in the anti-CAA protests, those at Shaheen Bagh. It's a resistance that would have inspired Khwaja Ahmad Abbas to write his next great novel were he alive. I think he would have loved the words of the young poet Joshua Bodhinetra from West Bengal, whose poems you will find on the People's Archive, whose poems tell us so much about the state we are in. I leave you with these lines from 2 verses from Joshua's different poems. God is a vaccine. God is a pill. God is a graveyard's unpaid bill. How do you spell shame? Is it with a sigh? Is it with a bullet in the laborer's eye? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sainath, sir. I know that many of us will have questions at the end of this extremely hard-hitting lecture. But due to the paucity of time, we will not have a Q&A at the end of the program. But members of the audience are free to put in their thoughts and comments in the chat box. And now I would request Mohini Ji to please say a few words.
Sainath, as usual, you have left us all spellbound. But that's not it. All our eyes were open all these years, but today they are widespread. Why? Because we have known all this, what you have told us. Of course, when you tell us it's a greater force, it touches my heart. We have tried our best in these 6 decades at least to do something, to change the system, but it's not been possible. You have said something that, yes, maybe we could change a few things. Next lecture from you, I would like to have only the solutions. In these 60 years of my known life, adulthood, I'm 83, I'm only wanting now to know what is the solution. I leave this world in a better way, where I could say that at least all are equal, all have their rights, my farmers have their rights, and everybody is happy. That's a very, very difficult assignment. But maybe in my lifetime, you'll give one more speech of this kind where you will tell us exactly how we should go about.
Sure.
Yes, things have not been good. I grew up in Lucknow, where there was a Ganga Jamuna culture, and I knew my best friends. I never knew who they were. They didn't know who I was. It was just Mohini and whatever. And today, when I find these discriminations, it really hurts me very much. You have been wonderful. I've always loved you, and my love for you will be greater if you really, in my lifetime at least, see that some solutions are found. Thank you so much. And Sayyida, you've always been an inspiration to me. हमेशा हमेशा से आपकी मदद से और आप जहाँ पर भी रहें वहाँ पर इन मुद्दों को लड़ती रहें आप, यही मैं अल्लाह से दुआ करती हूँ। और आपका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया कि आज आपने मुझको यहाँ बुलाया। शुक्रिया।
Thank you, Mohini ji. I would request Saida ji to please say a few words and give the vote of thanks.
मेरे पास अल्फाज ही नहीं हैं। कुछ tears are welling up क्योंकि हमने कितना कोशिश की है, स्ट्रगल किया है, और इस वक्त साईनाथ ने हमारे सामने जिन हालात को एक्सपोज करके रख दिया है, it's very, very hard to express a conventional thank you. Autopsy का लफ्ज is a very hard-hitting word. I know he had slides to show us, पर समय की कमी की वजह से उन्होंने नहीं दिखाया। हम शेयर करेंगे उन स्लाइड्स को। और मेरे मन में जो बात उन्होंने आखिर में कही पारी के हवाले से, जिसके इंसेप्शन के वक्त I was one of the many audience who saw Pari being birthed. The words of Joshua, the Bengali poet, क्या बात कही है उन्होंने, जिसमें लगता है कि it's a दिल के अंदर खंजर उतर जाता है जब ये बात आप सुनते हैं। एक हाइकू है, God is a vaccine, God is a pill, God is the graveyard's unpaid bill. आपके हम बहुत आभारी हैं। आप ख्वाजा अहमद अब्बास का जो आइडियल्स हैं उसको आपने मैनी फोल्ड उसको आगे बढ़ाया है। आज मुझे लगता है कि उनकी रूह जो है वो आपके लिए बेनेडिक्शन दे रही है, और शायद काफका या अब्बास आप ही लिखें, क्योंकि किसी के कलम में अब इतनी ताकत नहीं है। साइनाथ, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। एंड ओवर टू माय कॉलीग, fellow trustee Supreet. Thank you.
Thank you, Saida ji. And on behalf of the Khwaja Ahmad Abbas Memorial Trust and the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, I would just like to thank all the speakers and audience members for being a part of the birth anniversary of Abbas Sahab and joining us for this program today. Thank you and good night.